My name is Lisa. I am 22 years old, and I live in a suburb of Chicago, in a two-story house that my mother bought after her divorce from my father. When I was 18, she married Richard, my stepfather. He is now 55, an engineer at some construction company, tall, with gray hair at the temples and hands that always smell of metal and oil. My mother works as a manager at a company selling medical equipment, and she is often sent on business trips for several days. That is how I ended up in this story, which I still don't know whether to regret or not. In the early years, I didn't pay much attention to Richard. He was just my mother's husband, quiet, taciturn, always with a cup of coffee in the morning. But that all changed when I turned 22. I graduated from college, started working in a clothing store, and started spending more time at home. My mother would go away, and Richard and I would be alone. At first, it was little things, the way he looked at me when I was making breakfast, or the way his voice softened when he asked me how my day was. His eyes, gray and tired, suddenly began to linger on me a little longer than they should have. One morning, I came down to the kitchen in a t-shirt and shorts to make coffee. He was sitting at the table, reading the newspaper. I walked past him, brushing his chair, and set the cup in front of him. Our fingers brushed as he took it, and he looked up. "Thank you, Lisa," he said quietly, but there was something warm in his tone. I smiled and walked away, but I thought about it all day. Why did I even notice? Why did I want him to look at me like that again? A couple of weeks later, Mom went to Detroit for 3 days. Richard and I had dinner together, nothing fancy, just pizza and TV. I was sitting on the couch, he was in the chair next to me. I tried to fix my hair, looking over my shoulder at him, and noticed that he was watching me. "That haircut suits you," he said unexpectedly. I laughed, said something stupid like thanks, I try, but something inside me jumped. It was the first time I caught myself wanting his attention. After dinner, I was clearing the plates and he came over to help. We were standing at the sink and I moved closer so he could feel my presence. His hand brushed mine as he passed me the plate and I froze for a second. He didn't move away right away either. We were silent, but the air felt heavier. I went to bed, but I lay in the dark and thought, what's wrong with me? Why do I look at him not as a stepfather, but as a man? It was a beginning, and I didn't even know where it would lead me. After that first dinner together, I began to notice how often Richard and I were alone. My mother was away almost every week, to Detroit or Cleveland or somewhere else. Her job required it, and I didn't mind. I liked the quieter house, and the fun things Richard and I had to do. At first, it was just the usual stuff, watching movies, ordering food, sometimes he'd talk about his work. But the more often it happened, the more I saw him as more than just a stepfather. One night we decided to watch an old spy movie. I sat on the couch with my legs tucked under me, and he settled in next to me, not in the chair like I usually did, but closer to me. I was wearing a light tank top and shorts, nothing fancy, but I knew he'd notice. As I reached for the remote, my hand accidentally brushed his thigh. He didn't move, just looked at me. "You choose," he said, and I smiled, holding his gaze a little longer than necessary. I picked a movie and sat back down, moving so our shoulders were almost touching. He didn't move away. During the movie, I noticed how he sometimes turned his head in my direction. I decided to test him. I fixed my hair, slowly ran my hand over my neck, as if thinking. His gaze slid over me, and I felt warmth in my chest. "Aren't you cold?" he asked suddenly when I shivered, specifically so that he would notice. I said, "A little," and he handed me a blanket from the chair. His fingers brushed mine when I took it, and I deliberately held my hand for a second. He did not remove mine immediately. The next day, Mom was home, but she left again that evening. Richard and I were making dinner, nothing fancy, just pasta and salad. I stood at the stove stirring the sauce while he chopped vegetables nearby. I turned to him and said, "Let me try this," referring to the tomato he was holding. He held out a piece, and I leaned in close, almost brushing his arm with my shoulder. He watched me take the food and said nothing. Then I handed him the plate, brushing my elbow against his, and he paused for a moment before taking it. Later, we were sitting at the table and I decided to add fuel to the fire. "That shirt suits you," I said, looking straight at him. He smiled slightly and said, "Thank you. I haven't worn one in a while." I leaned a little closer, handing him the bread, and my hand remained next to his on the table. He didn't remove his, and we sat like that for a few seconds. Mom didn't see it, and the fact that it was all a secret made my insides clench. I knew it wasn't normal, but I liked feeling him next to me, noticing how he reacted. It was our little secret, just beginning. By then, I couldn't pretend it wasn't happening. It wasn't just curiosity or random thoughts. I wanted Richard to look at me, to feel what I felt. My mom was away in Atlanta for a week, and I figured this was my chance to see how far things could go. I hadn't planned anything specific, but I knew I was going to take action. One evening, I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when Richard came home from work. He looked tired, but he said hello anyway and asked how my day was. I said I'd missed being alone and invited him to sit next to me. He agreed, tossing his jacket over a chair and settling himself on the couch. I'd put on a tight t-shirt and leggings, nothing too revealing, but enough for him to notice. As I turned to him, fixing my hair, his gaze swept over me and he quickly looked away. Then something small happened that changed everything. My laptop started acting up. I was trying to open a file and it froze. I called out to Richard, "You're an engineer, right? Will you take a look?" He came over and sat down at the desk next to me, and I moved closer to show him the screen. Our shoulders touched, and I didn't move away. He clicked away at the keyboard, and I leaned in a little further so that my hand rested next to his on the desk. "Here's the problem," he said, pointing at the screen, and his fingers accidentally brushed mine. I didn't pull my hand away, and he didn't move his. Half an hour later he fixed it and I said, "You're my savior, thank you." And then I hugged him. It wasn't a quick hug. I pressed myself a little harder than necessary and held for a few seconds. His hands went to my back and I felt him tense up. His breathing got a little louder, but he didn't push me away. I pulled away slowly, looking into his eyes and said, "I don't know what I'd do without you." He nodded, muttered something like "You're welcome," and went into the kitchen. But I could tell he wasn't calm. The next day I continued. In the morning he was drinking coffee, and I came downstairs in a short robe over a t-shirt. I went up to him, leaned over to pick up an apple from the table, and my elbow lightly brushed his shoulder. "Good morning," I said, looking at him longer than usual. He said, "Good," but his gaze slid over me, and he quickly turned away to his mug. I sat down opposite him, crossing my legs, and began to eat my apple slowly, watching him. He said nothing, but I saw his fingers tighten around the handle of the mug. It was the first time I realized that he felt something, too. And I liked it more than I expected. After that hug, I knew there was no turning back. I couldn't stop myself. I loved the way Richard responded to me, the way he tried to keep his cool but still gave in to my gaze. Mom was in Atlanta for the rest of the week, and I decided to use this time to escalate our tension to the next level. I didn't want to say anything outright, but my actions spoke for themselves. And he seemed to know it. The next day, I started my morning by walking down to the kitchen in short shorts and a sleeveless t-shirt. Richard was already sitting there, drinking coffee and reading something on his tablet. I walked past him, lightly brushing his chair with my hip, and said, "Good morning, how did you sleep?" He looked up, looked at me, and replied, "Fine, and you?" His voice was calm, but I noticed him swallow as I leaned over to get milk from the fridge. I deliberately lingered in that position for a few seconds, feeling his eyes on me. Then I sat down opposite him and began drinking coffee, looking at him over the top of my mug. "Are you home all day today?" I asked. He nodded. "Yeah, not much work. Decided to take a rest." I smiled and said, "Okay, there'll be company." That afternoon, I decided to step up the game. He was sitting in the living room, watching the news, and I said I wanted to cook something for dinner. "Will you help me?" I asked, tilting my head to the side. He agreed, and we went into the kitchen. I chose a pasta recipe that required more movement, chopping, stirring, anything that would keep us close. I stood at the stove and he chopped vegetables at the table. I walked up to him with a spoonful of sauce and said, "Try this, how do you like it?" He looked at me, then at the spoon, and leaned closer. As he scooped up the sauce, his fingers brushed my hand, and I didn't pull it away right away. "It's delicious," he said, looking into my eyes. I said, "I'm glad you like it," and slowly pulled the spoon away, leaving my hand next to his on the table for a moment longer. That evening we found ourselves in the living room again. I put on a light top and shorts that barely covered my thighs. I sat on the couch, pulled my legs up, and said, "Let's watch something light." He sat down next to me, not in the chair like before, but closer to me. I chose a TV series, but I barely looked at the screen. Instead, I turned to him and asked, "Are you comfortable?" He nodded, but I noticed his hand resting on the armrest, just a few inches from mine. I moved a little closer so that our knees almost touched and put my hand on the back of the couch next to his shoulder. He didn't move away, only turned his head slightly towards me. "You seem different today," he said quietly. I laughed. Maybe I'm just in a good mood. But we both knew it was more than that. Later, I decided to add fuel to the fire. I stood up to get some water and walked past him so that my hand slid lightly over his shoulder. He froze, but said nothing. When I returned, I sat even closer, so that our thighs were now touching through the fabric. I could feel the heat of his body, and it was driving me crazy. "Aren't you hot?" I asked, looking at him straight in the eye. He shook his head. "No, it's fine." But his voice wavered, and I saw how he clenched his fingers on his knee. I put my hand on his shoulder, as if by accident, and left it there for a few seconds. He didn't take it away, just looked at me with a long look that I will never forget. The next day I went further. In the morning he was fixing something in the garage, and I went down there in a light t-shirt and denim shorts. "Need a hand?" I asked, standing next to him. He motioned for me to hold the wrench, and I leaned closer until our hands touched. I held the tool and he worked, and I could feel his fingers brushing mine every now and then. "You're doing well," he said, and I said, "You're easy." We finished, and I straightened up, pressing my side slightly against him. He didn't move away, just looked down at me, and I noticed his breathing deepen a little. By evening I could think of nothing else. We were eating dinner, and I handed him his plate, leaning over so that my hand lingered next to his on the table. "Thank you," he said, and I said, "You're welcome," looking him straight in the eye. Then I stood up to clear the dishes, and he came over to help. We were standing at the sink, and I moved closer on purpose so that our elbows touched. I washed the plate and he dried it, and his hand brushed mine several times. Each time I felt a current run through my body. Mom didn't know, and that made it all the more poignant. By the end of the week, the tension between us was palpable. I caught his eyes when I passed by, or when I sat across the table. He looked at me longer than he had before, and I knew he was playing this game, too. I wanted him to make a move, but he held back, maybe because of my mother, maybe because of himself. But I wasn't going to stop. I liked the feel of him around me, liked the way he was struggling with himself, and I knew something was going to happen soon. By Friday of that week, the tension between Richard and me had become unbearable. Mom was still in Atlanta, and I decided that this was my night. I wanted to push things to the edge, but not over the edge. After work, I offered to cook dinner. I wore a light top and short shorts, knowing he would notice. When he arrived, I was standing at the stove, frying a steak. "It smells good," he said, and I said, "Sit down, it'll be ready soon." He sat down, and I handed him the plate, leaning a little closer than necessary. My hand brushed his, and he looked at me. We ate and I sat with my leg next to his under the table. I lightly touched his knee, as if by accident, and he didn't move away. After dinner I said, "Let's watch a movie." He agreed and I sat on the couch, patting the seat next to me. He sat closer than usual, and our thighs touched. I chose a TV series, but I didn't follow the plot. I put my hand on the back of the couch, next to his shoulder, and he didn't move. "Are you comfortable?" I asked. He nodded, yes. I decided to take it further. "Your shoulders are tense," I said, and put my hands on his back, starting to massage. He relaxed under my fingers, and I leaned closer, so that my hair almost touched his neck. "Do you like it?" I asked quietly. He said, "Yes, thank you." I continued, feeling the warmth of his body. Then I sat back down, moving so that my leg rested on his knee. He looked at me, and I put my hand on his thigh. He did not remove it. We sat in silence, and I felt the air thicken. I slid my hand over his shoulder, then back to his hip, and he curled his fingers around the armrest. "Are you hot?" I asked, looking into his eyes. "No," he said, but his voice was quieter than usual. I moved closer, until my chest almost touched his arm. His breathing was quickening, and I knew he was on edge. I got up to get some water, passed him by, brushing his shoulder, and came back, sitting down so that our bodies were now completely touching. I put my hand on his chest, feeling his heartbeat. "It's late," I said, "but I don't want to sleep." He said, "Neither do I." I leaned closer, my hand sliding to his stomach, and he tensed. We were so close that I could feel his warmth all over my body. But then he stood up. "I'm tired," he said abruptly, and went into his room. I stayed on the couch, my heart pounding. We were almost there, but he stopped. And I didn't know what to feel. After the night Richard left, I knew there was no turning back. Mom was coming home in 2 days, and I decided Saturday was my last chance. I wanted to push it to the limit, to feel him as close as possible without going over the edge. In the morning, I came down to the kitchen in a thin t-shirt and shorts that barely covered my thighs. Richard was drinking coffee, and I said, "Good morning," brushing his shoulder as I passed. He said, "Good," and I saw his eyes wander over me. I sat down across from him, crossing my legs, and slowly sipped my coffee, looking at him. That afternoon, he said he needed to unpack some boxes in his room. "I'll help," I said, and we went upstairs. I stood next to him as he took things out of the closet, leaning closer than necessary to pick up a box. My hand slid down his back, and he paused for a second. Then I said, "Let me pick this up," and pressed my thigh against his. He didn't move away, just looked at me. We continued to work, and I could feel the tension between us growing. I leaned over to put things down, and my shirt rode up a little, exposing my stomach. His gaze lingered there, and I knew he'd noticed. By evening I had decided to be bolder. After dinner I said, "I'm going to take a shower, then we'll watch something." He nodded, and I left. I came back in the same t-shirt and shorts, with nothing underneath, and sat down on the couch next to him. "You choose," I said, putting my hand on his shoulder. He turned on a movie, but I could see he wasn't looking at the screen. I slid my hand down his back, slowly, as if kneading, and he tensed. "Are you comfortable?" I asked. He said, "Yes," but his voice was lower than usual. I moved closer, my foot resting on his knee, and I put my hand on his thigh. He turned to me, and I saw in his eyes what I had been waiting for. He wanted this. I stood up, came up behind him, and put my hands on his shoulders, leaning down so that my hair touched his neck. "Are you tired?" I asked quietly. "No," he said. I returned to the couch, sat close, and put my hand on his chest, feeling his breathing quicken. My hand slid lower, to his stomach, and he placed his palm on my thigh. His fingers squeezed my skin, and I moved closer until our bodies were almost fused. I looked at him, feeling the warmth of his hand pass through me. "Do you like being with me?" I asked, and he nodded, "Yes, Lisa." I slid my hand down his chest, then back to his thigh, and he squeezed my thigh harder. We were on the edge, and I knew he was going to give in. I leaned closer, my chest touching his hand, and his breathing became heavy. "Turn off the light," I said, and he reached for the switch. The room went dark, and I moved closer, placing my hand on his back. He turned to me, his hand sliding up my thigh, and I felt his fingers tremble. We were silent, but everything was leading up to it. I put my hand on his chest, slid it lower, and he moved closer to me. His hand lay on my waist, and I felt him struggling with himself. I leaned closer, our bodies now touching completely, and I said, "You want this, I know it." He didn't answer, only squeezed my waist tighter. We were so close that I felt his warmth with my whole body, and I knew that in another second everything would happen. But suddenly the phone rang. I flinched, and so did he. He picked up the receiver. It was my mother. "I'll be back in an hour. An accident on the road delayed me," she said. Richard answered, "Okay," and put the phone down. He stood up, looked at me, and said, "I need to get myself together." I nodded and sat there, my heart pounding. We were so close to what I wanted, and then it all fell apart. And you know what, viewers? I wish it hadn't happened, but somewhere inside I loved it. I wanted him, and he wanted me, and now it was all gone. After that call from my mother, everything changed. Richard went to his room, and I sat on the couch, staring at the dark TV screen. My heart was still pounding, my body was burning from what had almost happened, but my mind was beginning to understand that this was the end. An hour later, I heard my mother's car pull up. She walked in, tired, with a suitcase in her hands, and said, "It's been a terrible journey, so it's good to be home." I smiled, said, "Welcome," and went back to my room. Richard came down to say hello, but I didn't look at him. I couldn't. The next day he acted as if nothing had happened. In the morning he was sitting in the kitchen, drinking coffee, and I went down to get some water. "Good morning," I said, but he just nodded, not looking up from his mug. I was standing at the sink, and he walked past to pour himself another drink, not even accidentally brushing against me. It was not the same silence as before, full of tension and reticence. Now it was cold, empty. Mom was home, and I saw how he tried to be normal, asking her about the trip, helping her with her bags. But I knew he was avoiding me. That afternoon, I decided to check on him. Mom had gone to the store, and he was sitting in the living room, reading something on his tablet. I put on the same t-shirt as yesterday and sat down across from him. "Aren't you bored?" I asked, crossing my legs. He looked at me, but quickly looked away and said, "No, I have something to do." I leaned a little closer, handing him the remote, and my hand lingered near his. He took the remote without touching me and turned on the TV. I realized he had put a wall between us, and it cut deeper than I expected. That evening I stayed in my room. I heard Mom and Richard talking downstairs, laughing about something. I lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what I had done. I felt ashamed in front of Mom, even though she didn't know anything. I imagined what would have happened if she hadn't called, if Richard and I had gone through with it. Part of me wished it had, and another part of me screamed that I was crazy. I wanted him, and that feeling hadn't gone away, but now I saw that he wouldn't give me another chance. A week passed. Richard began leaving for work earlier, returning later. When we crossed paths, he said only the necessary things, pass the salt or close the window. I tried to catch his eye, but he looked away. My mother didn't notice, which made it even worse. I felt guilty, but also angry. Why had he shut me out so easily? I wanted that tension back, those moments when his hands touched me, when his gaze said more than words. But that would never happen again. You know, viewers, I think about this every day. I regret going so far, but somewhere inside I liked it. I liked the feeling of him. I liked that he wanted me. Now it's over, and I want everything to go back to the way it was before, just dinner, movies, talking. But it won't work. I screwed it up, and there's no going back. Sometimes I think I'd like to continue no matter what, but then I see my mom and I realize it was the biggest mistake of my life.